Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us today for the London CTO event, Challenges, Failures, and Lessons of Building Mobile Products at Scale. I know we've had a lot of the community asking me to host events in regards to failures. Failures seems to be a really big thing everyone's interested in. So I'm really excited about this event. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Marty and I'm the Community Manager for the London CTOs. I work with Barry Cranford, who's the founder of London CTOs. And for those of you who don't know, the CTOs is just one of the communities that's run by RecWorks, which is a tech recruitment company with a difference. So what we believe is that recruitment can be a force for good in the industry. I know sometimes recruitment consultants get a bit of a bad rap, but we want to do more than beyond just placing people in jobs and leaving them to it. We want to have a particular focus on learning, mentoring, and personal development, all the great stuff. So we sort of see this as a chance to give back to those we've worked with in the past, but also paying it forward to those we hope to work with in the future. So we've run over, I think it's 700 events for engineers and developers, students, graduates, CTOs. And in January this year, we actually made our 400th introduction through our Meet a Mentor program, which is absolutely amazing. Now, if you would like to know more about our different communities, please drop me a message on Slack or over on LinkedIn. I'm actually going to drop my LinkedIn profile in the chat so we can connect. And I can that way send you a replay of today's event. And any feedback we would love to hear as well. So without further ado, we are so excited to be speaking today to Carl from Novoda. Novoda have been an amazing support to the London CTO, so we're really delighted to have the team here. We also have Jack here as well from Novoda, and they are sponsoring today's event. So we're so grateful that Carl has given up his time today to give us a little bit of insight, and I'm so excited to hear what you're going to say, Carl. So I'm just going to hand over to you. And also I should just say that Jade, my colleague, is as well going to launch a poll as well. So if you can just take a quick look at that. And Carl, I'm going to hand over to you now, and I'm going to just completely stop talking.
Thank you, Marty. Thank you for the introduction. A lot of pressure here, challenges, failures, and lessons, yes, about building mobile product at scale. I can attest to what you just mentioned about RecWorks and Barry. Thank you so much for giving us the airspace to share some of the things that we are interested and excited about. And so this is really about building mobile product at scale. So who am I and why should you care about listening to me on the Monday? So I founded and I am the managing director of a company called Novoda. We are a digital product agency that has been building mobile apps for a good portion of 15 years. The reason I kind of introduce us like this is because 15 years ago, when we started, it was very much design and build. So somebody would come to us and say, hey, we need an app. We don't know why. We don't have any mobile capabilities. Can you build it for us? And we would say yes. While today, it's a bit different. Every single company that we talk to, or the majority, would have a mobile capacity in-house. And it shifted a bit from can you design and build mobile products for us to can you help us scale our mobile offering? And so we ended up working with a lot of companies that are in this kind of hyper growth mode, received a lot of funding and similar. And this is about sharing our learning, basically, from all those years as much as we can. And hopefully you can get something out of it. But first, I just want to mention something. I'm no expert at what everyone here does in the day-to-day basis. So this is obviously a CTO group. So I'm speaking with people that have a lot of responsibilities within organization, and I don't only have assumption about your challenges. I only fit within a little part of the picture that you need to solve. And so I hope some of this presentation will not come out as, too much assumption and maybe a bit cocky. Like I'll try to bring some of my learnings and what I've seen within organizations to the group here. And I very much welcome challenges to my thinking, challenges to my chain of reasoning, because this is something that I'm exploring at the moment. It's been maybe 12 months plus, maybe 2 years, let's say, in which we try to be a bit more explicit as to the challenges we see by building mobile product at scale. While our offering tends to be more like engineer of high quality that kind of come and work with you to build good apps, let's say. And what I'm trying to do here is to be more explicit about the roles of mobile within organization. And for that, I really need to speak with people. And I spoke with people already last week and the week before, which I'm extremely thankful for. That was introduced to us by Barry from RedWork. So again, the best way to learn is basically to go and seek information outside. And then I share back. So this is me sharing back. So what question am I trying to answer? What has been on my mind for about a good portion of the last few years as I've been driving Novoda, which is, okay, if the majority of consumers interact with your brand services through mobile, why is it so difficult to represent that within the engineering organization? And so this is obviously aimed at this group here. It's like, okay, if mobile is so important for business value, why, when we come in and we work with companies, it feels a bit like, shoehorning that into the organization. And so I'm trying to answer that question myself by speaking with a lot of people, by sharing my knowledge, and hopefully get feedback out of that. So maybe a bit of what those words means, so we at least align to the degree of that. So something just popped up on my screen. Up, I should do it. Scale. When I speak about scale here, is organization and companies that go through a certain amount of growth, usually hiring a lot of people, maybe going from 50 to 350 engineers within 12 to 18 months. And we've seen that we participated in some companies that are undergoing that type of scale. If you're part of an organization that is maybe less than 50 people, maybe this stuff is a bit less relevant. It's still probably interesting, but less relevant. We're really talking about companies that are hiring very quickly with all the chaos that comes with that type of change. And usually they scale because either they received a certain amount of funding, a sizable amount of funding, or because the market has changed and they need to adapt, or anything of that sort. Okay. And when I talk about product, and that I find a bit more harder to put a definition to, I would say it's an entity that creates a specific value to a consumer and as such a business. And a product is something that is solving a specific need from the consumer, and by doing so, let's say the company bring value into the picture. And finally, when I say mobile products, what I mean with mobile products is really about the most likely native mobile application that you gotten from a store that is like either Apple or Google store. I'm not referring to mobile web, which would be a version of your web experience, but in mobile, in this case, is very much about the mobile experience. Could be built obviously with cross-platform, Flutter, React Native, and so forth. But I mentioned the specific experience that is given to you from mobile. Okay. And I apologize if I move like this. That's my way to keep track, to have my mind concentrated. I hope it doesn't give any seasickness. But things that you care about, okay? And this is addressing the CTO community. I can appreciate that mobile might not be in the forefront of your mind as a problem you need to solve, because you just received tons of money and you need to hire 300 engineers, and you need to be able to enable the business to go faster. And how do you do so? And obviously, there are principles out there that express how you can do that well, DevOps being one, or you read the Accelerate book and you try to follow those patterns. You look at how to break up your monolith into microservices, or look at your data layer and think about potential machine learning, integrating that as a shiny new thing into your organization. You want to deploy faster. You want to be able to deploy to production like 5 times a day. You want to test in a way that you have extreme quick feedback. You want to observe your system in a way that makes you understand exactly what's happening constantly. And so all those things are probably in the sphere of your roles and responsibility as you receive this news that you just got tons of money to spend on scaling your engineering department. But now the digital experience journey, okay, that's like from the customer side, the ones that you're serving, they probably, or they don't care if it runs on microservices or a monolith or what type of database or like the DevOps practices that you use at the end of the day. I remember we worked with a British publisher who had a device attached to their users to appreciate how their journey from like waking up to going to bed, how it looks like in order to serve them better. The first interaction tends to be before 8 o'clock when when your phone rings because it wakes you up and you're probably clicking to read your news. This is pretty common to a lot of people here, yeah. And so you wake up, you then take your breakfast, and you have a second interaction when you go to work in the underground. So you need offline access. The first browser experience tends to start at noon when you're at work having lunch, and then in the evening again you go back home. And just a couple of years ago, you had tablet experience in the kitchen and potential TV experience in the living room, and the weekend would be more TV experience, tablet experience. Okay, and so you have this kind of journey that your customer are having across multiple devices, which today is mainly driven by this a mobile experience first, rather than the browser experience. The browser experience tends to come much later or comes at work, and is less and less and less of it as mobile becomes more prominent as what you can do from within mobile. And to map that, and I appreciate this might be not the best argument here, but like to map that to actual business value, there's an indication that if you have 4.5-star application, and this was comparatively probably to mobile-centric apps on the store, you have something around between 20 and 30% more revenue as an organization, and similar profit is increased with the quality of the application that you release on the store. This is a point that I probably want to explore a bit more, which I'm not going to do in this topic. This is not about product and value, but to give you an indication that if you as a CTO, like your intention here is to enable your business to scale in order for you to go faster and generate quicker business value, there is something there that if you focus on the digital experience that the consumer have of your brand, and you focus on your mobile experience, you're probably going to deliver value faster. Okay, but so my question is this, it's like, how well does your engineer organization mirror that customer journey? So when you look at how you organize yourself, how well does it map? Because if it doesn't map well, you will not be able to serve your client well. And if it does map, then you probably can just turn this off and say, I'm doing this first. I don't need to listen to the rest of this talk. But so this, again, as we come in, we see this over and over within the engineering organization. Mobile sits at a specific place, which is a bit weird. I'm failing to have a better word for it. And it's been mainly on my mind to answer why. And I think one of the challenges with mobile is that it doesn't really fit under the product office, nor does it really fit under the engineering office. Okay, because on one hand, you build something. Let's say a mobile engineer will build something, release it to the store, and will be judged of the quality of the work straight ahead by the consumers. 5-star, 1-star, 1-star, very demotivated. 5-star, you celebrate, you celebrate the amazing work you've done. And so, like engineers that are within the mobile engineering teams tends to be very much focused on the product that they deliver, because the value that they give is judged straight ahead. And at Novoda, for instance, I remember a lot of our engineers like to refer to themselves as product engineers. They like talking and thinking about the consumer that they serve, and that's their responsibility. They feel they have a responsibility making sure that the experience of the user is as good as you can get because that will lead, good ratings and a such like celebration of that team. But at the same time, there's a certain degree of engineering practices, how you deploy mobile application, how do you sit within the engineering organization, how well do you access the APIs, how do you participate in building those APIs, linting, the quality of the code base and so forth sits within the engineering department. So mobile has this weird place that sits in between engineering and product. And ideally, if you ask me ideally, I would say like, okay, well, 80 to 90% of the code base should be related to UI, user interfaces, and the user experience of those devices. But the reality is not that. The reality is pretty more 50-50. You have 50% of a degree of backend type of, within mobile, backend type of code that connects to APIs, cache, and so forth, and maybe 50% that relates to the UI and UX. And that is the challenge, okay? So I came up with kind of two hypotheses to this language presented so far, which is, okay, if you can increase your business value if your engineering department support better your mobile teams. And the second hypothesis is getting mobile right is hard and challenging because there's no clear ownership between product and engineering. Okay, and in the remaining slide, I'll try to unpack some of this a bit better. Okay, but let's first see. So why is mobile a challenge? Because I obviously, as I present this, I separate mobile engineering from the rest of your engineering department. This is the kind of assumption that we've seen. And so let's unpack what makes mobile different. I hope I'm not going too fast. I'm going to slow down a bit. And I apologize if this goes a bit more low level. But here we go. So first, from a coding perspective, you obviously have two different languages. You have Kotlin for Android or Java. You have Swift or Objective-C for iOS. And then probably the remaining of the languages that sits within your engineering department being Rust for DevOps or Node.js for microservices or C# if you're a Microsoft shop. And so like any developer, Android and iOS tend to remain within their language bubbles. So they kind of like working with Kotlin because that's what they know, or they like working with Swift because that's what they know. And then they're a bit averse to kind of like go outside of that. They're also within their walled garden that is very much protected by Apple and Google, and let alone like get them to work with the rest of your organization when it comes to coding practices and so forth. You even see that to the extent where you start having Swift at the backend type of solution popping up, which I must have found a bit strange. You use the tools and language that is needed for the job to be done correctly. But this is already a challenge which separates, let's say, the engineers within the mobile team to the rest of the organization. You should also consider like building a mobile app requires offline access, most likely. I mean, most application nowadays has a degree of offline capability. Offline access is probably not the correct wording there. Offline capabilities rather than access, and you need to look at caching. And so if your mobile app is expected to work offline, there's a sizable amount of work that is done there in order to achieve that. That is putting your JSON into SQLite, potentially sometimes filtering what is needed for offline access or not. I remember, in many occasions, at least in the early days, a lot of the work in the coders was basically doing a lot of API call to cache it, so then the app could be used offline. And then there's state management. Again, we're not talking about backend state that turns there, but there's still a lot of complexity in the mobile architecture in order to support state management. There's threading, there's different UIs for tablets, different for different screen sizes, and you might be killed by the system. And if a phone call comes in, they might kill your application in an unknown state. You start by clicking from a notification or from the logo. So like the state of your application is something that evolves much more than, let's say, a web application in which you can just like refresh the page and then you're probably back on track into where you were left last time. But in a mobile app, it's different. You have like caching, you have states, you have to consider all those things as you build your mobile product. And then when it comes to build and test, again, to integrate further into your engineering department, again, is different. On Android and iOS have their own system, their own complex tool chain. On Android, you have Gradle. On iOS, you have Xcode Plus. You cannot really move away from them. If you try, it will be painful. So you have those different tools that is part of your engineering that you need to support and maintain. And it makes, let's say, integrating mobile to the rest of the organization a bit more challenging. And for instance, there's still stuff that you need to consider and learn, because in some instances we had build time of an hour plus from a clean build. And so if you multiply that by the number of engineers every time they lose time by building the mobile application, you can see how much you lose in terms of productivity. And so now you have to understand better that tool chain, and in order to integrate better as part of your process. Going then further to that, you have the testing phase. So testing on mobile is a challenge. You have things like location and others that comes into the picture, but also just end-to-end tests can be very fiddly. As I mentioned before, you know, a device can just pop up because, let's say, the battery is down and behave differently. And it's hard to manage that in an environment that is completely controlled by yourself. You need physical devices to do those tests, and those physical devices need to be attached to a computer and so forth. Developer tends to use latest devices to do their own testing as they code their application, which is probably not representative of your users. And then when you try to run that in continuous integration and continuous deployment infrastructure, it's even more complicated. If you want to test, let's say, iOS devices, which you should do, you need Mac machines in order to do that, because you need Mac to be able to compile and run iOS applications. And so you have this layer of complexity added to mobile, which, if you haven't thought about it, just feels not necessary. But it exists, it is there. And then finally, like modularization, again, if you grow and you grow your team because you're scaling and you go from 5, 10, 15, 20, 25 engineers, you need to start breaking down those into modules, and then having different modules leads to a longer build times, which leads to a less good developer experience. And again, it's a challenge for you as a head of a department to kind of solve all those problems, which seems to be very narrow to just mobile. And then finally, you're ready to release and monitor and deploy those applications. And this is where it becomes more problematic, because there's no rollback. When released, it is released. It's literally installed in an environment that you do not have control over. It's on clients that you cannot force to either upgrade or change. And so it's out there in the world. And if you need to roll back, you can't. You need to have a hot fix that up the version of your application, and you still need the user involved in that decision to roll back or actually upgrade the application to the latest release that you want them to be at, which also lead to then API support and versioning. So now that it's out there, you need to support it. So if you have a typo in your APIs, you cannot just change it. You cannot just validate that X amount of your services is up to date, because the majority of your users will not necessarily upgrade within the same day, especially if you're across Europe or the world. It's going to be even harder, because you need to support in the long run all those different devices with all those different API version and versioning. And you need to wait on Google and iOS. So you put something on the stores, something can take up to 2 weeks, and sometimes you even get refused the upgrade or refused the app on the store for a reason that might be obvious sometimes and sometimes less so. But again, you're at the mercy of the duopoly between Google and Apple in the way that you want to release your product, your solution. And you might include in that material that relates to marketing as part of that release. And finally, any tool that you have internally, like Datadog or similar in terms of observability, I'm going to use that to be able to observe like the quality of the application. But you fail at that because those tools are not meant for mobile. You have mobile-specific third-party tool like Crashlytics and similar, and that's another tool that you need to maintain and take part of your engineering department. So all this kind of like surface the challenges that comes with mobile from a very low level, and then I want to touch on a point that I hear quite a lot, which is web-centric versus mobile-centric. And this has been on my mind. I still don't have a full chain of reasoning on how to express this well. But if you think from a behavioral perspective, okay, so take it from a consumer perspective, a web-centric approach is very active, very request reply. because the user opened the browser with the intention of doing an action. Let's say checking your bank account or something similar. So you would open the account, you would connect you would log in and connect to your bank, and then you would say, give me my bank account. Okay. And so you probably build your services around this behavior, which is very request reply. So you like REST-based, we say, I want this, thank you, I got that, now display it. A mobile-centric approach is probably much more evented, publish subscribe methodology, you have push notification. The majority of apps get opened through the notification side of things, and so it can act on events that happens outside of the user's control, and so you can bring the user back into your brand when it seems fit. It can be location based, it can be a lot of different events that can lead to the user entering back into the brands through the application. And so when we say mobile centric, for me is really looking at how you organize your architecture from a more evented approach or a publish subscribe approach. And if you do that properly, you have ability to serve your user better. And so web-centric and mobile-centric in terms of like API development, or the way that you see how to build APIs, is quite different. And I remember, and to give you an example, for instance, we worked with did I mention this already? I've repeated this so many times. I'm not sure if I mentioned this, but like a publisher, and I didn't, a British publisher a long time ago. And they had something like we wanted offline access, because we obviously want to read the news when you take the train or the underground. And so we decided, okay, we need to download a full edition in order to provide these capabilities. And it was, they built all the APIs for web first. And to be able to achieve offline access, we had to do something like 256 API calls, or 250 API calls, sorry. So I had to like get all the edition, get all the articles, et cetera, which will take like, say 10 minutes. And we package that up, and then we put it in SQLite, and now you had offline access. This is obviously not good in terms of organizing a web-centric approach to building a solution here. We managed to then push that to the backend, because the reality is like most of the complexity you wanted to lie in an environment that you control. So you wanted to rely at the backend and have just, let's say, the front end surfacing user behavior. But again, you need to build the APIs to match the behavior for mobile, and it is different than web centricity. So, sound familiar? And I'm sure this is a leading question, given that I just presented a lot of the challenges with mobile. So you might be like, oh, yes, this sounds familiar. But just to reiterate a bit, okay, does mobile feel like a black box? You know, it's on its own island. It's very difficult to push innovative features into mobile. Technically, it feels a bit like an oddity. You have an ambition to break down your services into microservices and have cross-functional teams that have like clear goals and so forth. While mobile is just this one monolith that has this one binary per platform that represents your entire brand and your entire services into this one thing that you release an app store and you have no control over. There's no rollbacks and there's no observability around them. It feels overly complex and expensive. I mean, if I need to build something, let's say with a web front end and my API team, it can be done within a week. But when I try to do the same with mobile, it seems to be like a month. Why is that? Why is it so much longer? Why is it so much more expensive to do it on mobile? And there's a strange team dynamics here, as if, let's say, the API gateway is the wall that separates the mobile team from the rest of the organization. The mobile team don't interact with the backend, and the backend don't interact with the mobile team. It seems that the backend team thinks that it's oversimplified the complexity of mobile, and just mobile engineers are very averse in touching anything that is not relating to mobile. And so if this sounds familiar, which that this leads to, well, it leads to isolated mobile teams with an overflown backlog. There are no clear boundaries, which tickets goes where. Like the mobile team gets really, really busy very quickly because everyone within the organization has a degree of need from the mobile team, but that boundary is not very clear because of the backlog being filled up. It feels impossible to drive innovation. You cannot really experiment on mobile, even though your users are on mobile. And as such, you know, as a as a CTO, you start questioning the technology that sits in mobile. Maybe it's too complicated. Maybe we've overcomplicated the mobile engineering here at company X. Maybe we should look at React Native, or maybe Flutter could be a solution to all those problems in order for us to go faster. Or maybe more isolation is necessary. That is, let's create an innovation lab over there with 20 engineers, mobile plus backend, no web frontend, and they will deal with this kind of mobile product side of things. So I don't really have to care, and then we'll be clear on the boundaries between that team and the rest of the organization. And we've seen this, by the way. I mean, we've been part of a lot of innovation labs. We've been part of a lot of companies that want to move away from their native stacks. Okay, so look at the case study to reinforce this point. Checking on time. Mobile challenge within a web-centric marketplace. And so this is a company, so a bit of context, it's a 250 million in revenue, about 500 employees, 150 engineers. It's a sizable organization with a strong digital presence in several European countries. This is paraphrasing, by the way, but this is a proper case study. They declared themselves as web-centric. They formed in the late 90s. So digital-first organization. Back then they were cool. Now they're less so. They refer to themselves very much as being web-centric, still in a negative way nowadays. And for the last 5 years or so, the board has been pushing to become mobile-centric. And that language is heard at the C-suite level as much as the developer level. They recently migrated to microservices. In the 2000s, they had like their own data centers, and now they are on the cloud, or in the cloud, with microservices everywhere. They broke down the data layers and so forth. They worked with a very famous consultancy company to achieve that, and they have a very ambitious product push. So they changed the leadership, and they have renewed ambition to corner the market better, the market share better, and they've seen some negative trends in mobile. That is, the user acquisition and the dwell time of the user in the app is going down. It's a highly competitive market. They are not sure why that is. They're functioning in a certain way. And so we were speaking with the CTO on all those points for a fair amount of time. And guess what question they asked us? After all this, they presented and they say, Carl, should we adopt a cross-platform technology? So we say, okay, well, let's figure it out. We went out, we took some experts in Kotlin multi-platform and React Native and in Flutter, plus native developers, and we put the team together and say, okay, let's figure out what we can do here. We spent 50 hours of interviewing people from top down, so like at the C-level, the CTO, the CPO, and so forth, all the way down to the developers themselves on the team, on the web team, on the mobile team. We spoke with about 30 people for 5 weeks. And we spoke with 7 companies that were working kind of in the same space with the same amount of engineers to come up with a answer. I mean, clear here, like cross-platform was a bit of a dud. Nobody really cared about cross-platform. The challenges were different, and challenges kind of lied a bit here. So if you looked at how the department were organized, you have things like user retention, user acquisitions, monetization, seller satisfaction, search. They were all team squads, or whatever terminology we want to use, which has all the capabilities, cross-functional teams. So I think they were React front-end, back-end, I forgot the language, DevOps, design, product, all were represented within those teams. And as you can see, it's quite implicit as to what they're trying to do as a team. The KPIs are quite implicit, even though they could be a bit more explicit. But just by saying user retention, you understand that the intention of that team is to make sure that the users are happy and they stay within the application. And then you had iOS and Android, 2 other teams that had no clear KPI. What is the KPI of a team that is called iOS or a team that is called Android? Is it just to have an Android app, or is it just to have an iOS app? It was unclear on where they were sitting, even though they were part of the same organization. Yeah. So on one hand, you had like this cross-functional full stack engineers, and then you had this other that were doing mobile. To solve that problem, they thought, okay, well, how about if iOS KPIs is under user retention and Android is under user acquisition? And because both of them are mobile, at some point or the other. They'll just sync up and align on KPIs. Obviously, that did not happen. What challenges did we see after doing all those interviews? Well, there was a very low developer engagement. The employee engagement was relatively high across the organization, except the mobile teams. There was a lack of trust and leadership on vision of what the mobile teams were about. There was an overflown backlog because all these other teams needed to have something from the mobile teams. So they kind of like pulled that and like forced it into the backlog of the mobile teams, sometimes within the sprint itself. And the mobile teams were completely overwhelmed by all this work that was external to what they were trying to do. And that led to no experimentation on mobile. So remember when I said they were trying to move to a mobile-centric approach coming from the board? You had like product people that were not necessarily experienced in mobile, that every time they tried to interact with the mobile team got pushed out because they were so busy. And so they were trying to experiment on mobile because they knew that the user were on mobile and they wanted to serve the user better, but it was just too difficult. So then they landed and experimented with web first, which then drive APIs for those experimentation, which then drives the feature sets that that company was building. And mobile was always a second-class citizen to that effort. So no experimentation were happening on mobile. And finally, there was a complete lack of ownership. You know, the product office suggested this was a challenge with engineering. The app is badly built. We cannot move fast. It's hard to do something with mobile because it seems to be buggy all the time and crashes all the time. While engineers actually was product. So it's a lack of roadmap. There's a lack of vision of the application. We don't know what we're serving with this app there, this Android app or this iOS app. And so there was this kind of battle between engineering and product and no clear definition on what the role were for the mobile teams. And that created the most amount of frustration. So we needed to solve that. So we basically went from, should we adopt a cross-platform technology to a kind of more wider questioning, which is what changes the strategy should we recommend in order to increase the throughput and hence the quality of the output of the mobile teams. Do you have a mouthful? Should we work on that? And that led to two suggestions, okay? And you know, there's no magic, fairly simple. One was the flow of external tickets, that is the tickets that came from teams that were not the Android or iOS team, being generated and how they flow into the app team is causing additional unmeasured work. So that's an issue that needs to resolve. So our suggestion was, okay, well, why don't we create mobile product teams that mirror the structure of the product teams and work in close alignment to that? So like representing all those product teams within the app group, as it was called. And the second issue was the app team's capacity limits both the rate at which features are completed and the ability of the team to make improvement to its capacity. So basically letting the team solve their own problem when it comes to like the quality. And so the suggestion here was to create an explicit focus on improving developer experience to unlock productivity gains. So in practice, how does that look? A bit higher level. And so we had those different teams on the user acquisition, retention, monetization as an example. Each had their own iOS and Android engineers. I put a question mark there because the numbers were still to be defined. They had some capabilities when it comes to user research, product management, engineering management, and that is all supported by this core mobile platform team that is responsible for accelerating the mobile development, the tooling, making sure that it integrates better into the rest of the organization. And so this was our suggestion, and it's a bit too early to say if it's working or not because it was a bit recent, but other thoughts into that. When we presented this, one of the first things was, well, the mobile team will really grow drastically, because going from, I think it was 12 engineers, both in Android and iOS, if each of those platform team required more people, that kind of like elevate the number to something like 30. And so speaking with other CTOs within other organizations, is like, okay, when does this become useful? And I think like if you're sub 16 or 20 engineers, probably breaking it down like this is not that useful. You're adding a layer of communication and challenges and management that is not necessary. And you probably could manage with this Android and iOS. But if you intend to scale, so if you want to add a certain amount of engineers to your team and the ability to then tackle market-specific intention and have teams that adapt those KPIs, that is probably a good idea. So like 16 engineers or less, probably not worth it. 16 engineers plus, and you intend to scale and grow that team, probably you should look at it this way. Roles and responsibility of the platform team. I'm not sure how many people here have a platform product divide as part of the engineering department. It took me some time to kind of look at what does that mean from a mobile perspective, and actually there's quite a lot of stuff that a platforms team can do within a mobile team. It was suggested something around 30% should be part of the platform team, and the platform team's roles and responsibility, from looking at the design system to tooling, to build tools. If your build tool is an hour and you manage to reduce it to 15 minutes, you can imagine how much happier developers would be on those teams. And so like that was kind of like the percentage of the teams that should be focused on the developer experience. Flutter and cross-platform was still questioned. So even though we presented this as a challenge with an organizational challenge rather than a tooling or technologies challenge, it was still like, there was still this nagging feeling of like, but are you sure that like all our organizational problem could be solved with a tool like Flutter? And actually, as I was speaking with CTOs last week, something I really liked that came up was, you know, iOS and Android don't even talk to each other, but if you have this layer that makes them bridge and have empathy for each other, that's a big plus. And having something like Flutter forces that. And I quite like this idea of empathy between engineers, and that the tool can help with that. And then finally, if you elevate what I just presented a bit further and you look at, instead of team structure value stream, you can even go further down, mapping the value that you bring from a business perspective into the team structure. But this is still something I'm exploring and speaking with different companies about how to do so within an organization. So what? This is my final slide, and then I can look at questions. What is this all about? What I've tried to say is well, try to reflect your organization and your mobile teams. That is like, your customer will thank you if you have the ability to serve them well. Make sure that that is well represented in the way that you look at your engineering. Hire people with empathy and broad knowledge. You know, people that can come in, that don't mind jumping between the different technologies and talk to each other. So you'll have a better cross-functional structure, especially in mobile, because mobile tend to be fairly focused on their own skill set. If you have mobile engineers that are happy to talk with backend, and this is something that we at Novoda are trying to work on or train people on. I think it's important. It's important to have this curiosity mind when you have engineers and look for people that fit that mold. Thinking customer experience. Customer experience is really important for the value that your business bring to its customers. So get closer to the CPO, maybe try to understand the journey better, try to understand how that journey map to what you do on a day-to-day basis on the different teams that you manage. And then involve mobile early as part of your decision. That is, think from a mobile perspective on which, let's say, CI tool you're choosing or how you build your API. Involve them in their thinking, because you might be surprised as to how they might think an API should look like for mobile. And that is it. I hope. Thank you so much.
That was amazing. Thank you so much. We have actually got quite a few questions coming in, so I'm just going to run through a couple of them.
Sure.
Where has that gone? John was asking, he'd like to know if Carl sees any difference in the complexity issue between the native apps he's concentrating on now and, does that say React native apps? Does that make sense?
Where can I see the questions?
It's a little bit further up. Or John, if you're
yeah, it's you were talking, Carl, about the native apps, concentrating on that, and I was wondering what would it be different if there was React Native in particular, because that's much closer to the web tech that this company was based on.
Yeah, so I think I understand. So couple of things there. It feels like React Native, okay, and this is my opinion, please. Yeah, I understand the question, because okay, you have like a team that might focus on JavaScript, so there's full stack engineers, and so they have like potential React capabilities, Node.js capabilities in order to publish to like serverless. And then you look at, okay, React Native is a JavaScript-based solution. What I would say is I've heard some good stories about React Native. I heard a lot of challenging stories. We played a bit with React Native in some circumstances, and it is a challenge. It feels like JavaScript, but the tooling is different. Deploying is different. And it's very difficult to manage deployment. That is, you still need a strong Android and iOS capabilities in order to support React Native. And sometimes you would have a module, let's say a React Native module, that looks really good on paper on the GitHub page that says, okay, this is an authentication module. And you just say, oh, good, I'm just going to drop it in. And it works extremely well on Android because it was built for Android, let's say. And then let's say iOS was the second thought. And then when you try on iOS, or the other way around, by the way, it just fails constantly. And then you spend, let's say, 2 weeks fixing that module's code. And usually that means going lower than the JavaScript part. So you need like the iOS engineer to debug it, and then the iOS engineer to work out a solution. And so you have this kind of like weird setup in which it's quite stable on anything that is Facebook related, but anything else becomes more challenging. And so you need to have a very strong engineering team that is strong in JavaScript, in iOS and Android to make React Native a success. So don't say, you see, like, and if you have that, that's okay. But I would be, you know, like, I would be, in order to assess that, you need to have the team committing to working hard to get there. If that makes sense. Because otherwise, and you'll have that a lot from mobile engineers, at least, they'll be a bit averse to JavaScript. And they're like, oh, this will never be as good as an experience in native, which is true, by the way. No cross-platform. Flutter might be the closest, but no cross-platform will have as good as an experience as native because you always have a layer away from native. And so you'll have this kind of like product engineers mindset thinking the experience will not be as good. I'm not really sure what I'm winning. And it looks simple, but at the end, it could be a bit more complicated than expected. And this is especially true when you do like a proof of concept. You say, look, I managed to get a list of, you know, a list of something, list of items from an API call in React Native. We should adopt it. And they're like, that's not the hard part. The hard part is at the edges. So it's like when you try to do things that are a bit not the kind of usual API call and display it, is when you try to do something like, I don't know, casting or something a bit more like down to the metal on Android or iOS. And that's when you realize that React Native doesn't really fit well, and you spend a lot working on the React Native SDK rather than on the code that you want to, on the business code. Does that answer? Not sure if I answered.
Yeah, thanks. That's really interesting.
We've got another question from Chris. How important is Android, iOS? Is that parity? Aligning with the customer? It's unlikely that any customer uses both platforms.
I can tell you a war story. So we're working with a this was another marketplace a long time ago, and they said they had an iOS application and they wanted an Android application, and they say, we just need you to build the Android application. And they were like a small startup, which ended up becoming $1 billion startup. And they were like, okay, can you build the Android app? And we're like, you really don't have much money here. We have just X amount of weeks of ability. So we need to really nail down what you need as a feature set, and say, sure. And so they nailed down what the feature set were, but then they realized, okay, well, they have a chat system that's coming up, and they might have an iOS, you know, person chatting with an Android person. And so you need to have like the same feature set kind of like on both applications if you want to have the same experience. So it ended up having like, oh, but you need to implement this, you need to implement this, you need to implement this in order to be, not necessarily they use the term parity, but more like for the customer experience to be the same. Now, I don't think it's a must. But you don't want to have, let's say, half of the users, you know, complaining about it not being the same on the other platform. So you see like a sprint or 2 sprint off in terms of parity, I reckon is okay. And what we've seen in many cases actually is like, you might want to target a specific user as if you try to get the market fit. So if it's a new product, it's quite expensive to do it on both platforms at the same time. So you might want to lead with one platform, but you should really aim at having a degree of parity at some point or the other. And to add to that, by the way, is like what we've seen in some organizations is actually a move to Flutter to gain that parity. And so I mean, really, have we seen like the team dynamic being good on Android and iOS at the same time? So you always have one team that lag maybe the other team. And I spoke with some companies in which they introduced Flutter to get to that parity better. So then you have, let's say, an Android team that can help the iOS team get to parity. And that's a good way of seeing it. I think what we suggested in the past, which I quite like, which is have one backlog ticket for both Android and iOS. You start having more conversation, you have like API discussion that is done with both teams, and then you build it together. Or at least even if you have like 1 week off, but you have more collaboration between iOS and Android. The least amount of collaboration is the problem, I think, with the lack of parity for me is more like if Android is 2 or 3 months ahead, they'll never speak with the iOS team, or the iOS team will never speak with the Android team. They will just be separated because they're not working on the same things. I hope that answers the question. I'm more than happy, by the way, to answer more details outside of this call.
We have got another question from, is it? Oh, I've lost it. It's gone. Nitish, I'm so sorry. I'm sure that's not how you say your name, and it's much nicer than the way I'm pronouncing it in my awful accent. Can you see it there, Carl? I missed why going on with non-cross-functional was preferred over Flutter or React Native. Any thoughts on progressive web apps? Feel free to come up and ask, Nitish, if I've...
But I miss we're going...
Or you want to add to that?
With non-cross-functional was preferred.
Hopefully they're still here.
Any thought on progressive web apps? Well, I can answer the progressive web apps. I mean, it's war stories if you look at it from from a publisher perspective. I liked it. I really like it. I think like if you start off, I think the best thing to start off with, if you're completely new, will be mobile web. So make sure you get that right, because then you have the most amount of users. It depends. You see, like if you're in a highly competitive market, I wonder if progressive web apps will make you competitive against someone else who might be mobile focused and have a native experience. And I think as well, if you're scaling your capabilities, and mobile is really important as part of the customer experience. I'm not familiar with the customer experience in which progressive web apps were positive. It's okay if you just have to display information about something. If you need to really map to the customer journey, it will just not do. Apple is not very good with progressive web apps. Google a bit more, but still is very broken. There's a Google Maps progressive web apps as an example. The UI is very buggy. The frame rate is not so good. So again, it's like, it depends what you're trying to achieve. Is it just to have something out there? Then yes. If it's because you really want to nail the customer experience to the point that you really answer their needs, probably not. I don't really fully understand why going with non-cross-functional was preferred over Flutter or React Native. If you could elaborate on that, I could try to answer.
We do have one last question. I think we'll finish up here from Michael. It's a lot of questions. If you can see it there, Carl, maybe just choose 1 or 2 little bits there you can answer about experience or feelings about, is it Swift?
Yeah, Jetpack Compose and Swift UI. Sometimes I feel like mobile is 10 years behind the web in all sides of the technology stack, from debugging to like live reloads and stuff like this. And, you know, obviously kind of reactive UI comes from, let's say, the React trend. And trends tends to create a degree of innovation. What I would say, and like I think productivity will go up because you would then have more of a focus on the UI and the user experience. What I would hope is that by having Swift UI and Jetpack Compose in this reactive way, you might abstract better the necessity of gather data from the UI and the UX. And so going back to the picture I mentioned before around, let's say, X amount, 80% of the app should be like relating to UI UX, that might lead towards that more than what we currently have, especially if you have patterns that comes, which will be both for iOS and Android. And you could even see things like Kotlin multi-platform that ends up being the underlying data layer or backend layer. And then you would have Jetpack Compose and Swift UI on top of that. And so now we have a good separation in which you have a really amazing user experience that maps to this platform and is specific to the platform, and a shared code base with anything that is connecting to your APIs, getting the data, caching, and so forth. That for me is a good picture of how to build this well. Yeah, it's like what I found a bit frustrating sometimes is like Swift. If you compare Swift and Swift and Kotlin, they're like 90% the same, but the 10% is the challenging bit. And the same here. Swift UI and Jetpack Compose are very similar, but different enough. You know, Apple will never, you know, align to stuff that Google is doing. Maybe Google a bit more because they care a bit less, but you have this kind of duopoly fight in which they want to keep their developer experience really controlled within the walled garden, as I mentioned before. And you have that with this type of tooling that is coming out, where it's not the same build tool, it's not the same frameworks, even though they are so similar, so similar. And then you end up going to meetups, like let's say Android meetup or iOS meetup, and they complain about each other, how one is better than the other, which I always found like fascinatingly strange, because it's so much the same thing. We're building for the consumer and for it to be enjoyable experience for the consumer. And the tools are just like not helping to align Android and iOS, let alone the backend. Yeah, I think if I can add just because there's some question around obviously cross-functional and cross-platform technologies. React Native, I think there's a lot of downward trends with most of those cross-platform technologies, except for Flutter. Flutter is gaining a lot of traction. I have no preference, by the way, so I'm not advocating Flutter, but I must say I've heard every time I speak with people that have looked at Flutter and I have adopted it, very positive feedback, which I haven't necessarily with React Native. React Native has been a pain, or we tried and then we went back, or we tried, is working, but it's painful. While Flutter seems to be coming back with oh yes, I have iOS and Android developers that are talking to each other. They are liking the language. It's not their preference, but they're liking it, and it seems to have, you know, a good trend at the moment. Thank you, David. John, validating the point.
Amazing. I think we're going to have to wrap it up there, although I think everyone could talk to you for another hour easily. That just flew by, didn't it? That was amazing. Thank you so much, Carl. A little Zoom round of applause. Thank you so much for sparing some time for us today. That was absolutely amazing. I think we might have to get you back on again at some point because that just went too quick.
Thank you so much as well for organizing and channeling the questions, and everyone for listening, and also all the people if they're here, which I interviewed last week. I want to again voice a massive thank you, because I might have some knowledge when it comes to mobile, but anything that comes from the CTO side of things, I'm still seeking learnings there. So anyone else who wants to talk to me, I'm more than welcome. Like, I love talking with people that are involved in this to a degree or another, especially if you disagree with me. I would like to understand why.
Got some flames in the comments, so I mean, you've done an amazing job to get some flames.
I'll go through them. So thank you again, and thank you, Request, and everyone here.
And thanks so much, everyone, for joining. If you would like to get a replay, come and connect with me over on LinkedIn, and I can send you through a replay. But again, thank you so much, Carl. That was absolutely amazing.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.